Yes. Okay. Well, life again. Um, this is Life with a Transformer, Victor Prince Dickson. And in case you've not joined any of our live or maybe watch any of the replays, I think you do well to watch. And then you can like, you can share as well as subscribe to the channel just so that you really get to get insight or be updated anytime we start this journey on workplace transformation. And if you've been following me, you know I always lay this foundation. I never stop doing that because for me, I keep repeating this just so that it becomes a very, very strong perspective, a strong anchor to all our discussions. I believe very strongly that everyone is divided. The whole world is divided into two, whatever your class, whatever your gender, your exposure, your education, whatever it is. The fact remains the same that everyone is divided into two simple classes. People will call human assets and then human liabilities. Human assets are those who give more than they take. So even if they come into a relationship, they make sure that they give more than they take. They come into business, they make sure they give more than they take. If you bring them into a place of work, they will always add more value than they take from that organization. And so, generally speaking, the whole of humanity, the progress of humanity depends on human assets, while human liability are those who consistently they take more than the give. So, which means they withdraw more from the system and then they give less into the system. So, in principle, retrogression, stagnation, they're the one who most times break systems down. And if you understand this basic principle, this basic logic of human capital, then you will understand that everything about performance is hinged, on this simple logic. Therefore, my work generally, whether from a coach lens or whether from a business consultant, consistently, even as a facilitator, is to be able to help people move from the place of human liability to become human assets. And make no mistake about it, everyone actually started life from, becoming a liability. But over the years, training, exposure, reading, studying, engaging, eventually helps us to over the years to transit to become human asset. um, on YouTube every Monday I make sure I discuss anything that has to do work related transformation is always my core. And then on Fridays on Facebook, I discuss on personal transformation. And my reason is simple. I've been a little bit long in the field to understand this. My experience consistently has shown that you may have organization that is doing so well structured, the SOPs are done well, the leadership pipeline well structured. Every single T's and I's you expect an organization to have, everything is put together as a collective whole. But oftentimes the sickness, the infection comes from the individuals that enter into that organization. Even with the exponential growth of psychometrics and all this leadership evaluation, performance evaluation that we use to be able to dig deeper into the cognitive world of the people that come into the place of work. The fact still remains that that has not stopped um, individuals coming to the organization with the bundles, with their own personal baggages. So at the end of the day, however good an organization is structured, as long as you have people coming into the system, these people will come in with a lot of what makes them, their experience, their culture, their exposure, everything that makes them will find their way into the organization. And sometimes the entire recruitment process might be able to dictate one or two, but sometimes most of them, some of them also are latent. Some you may not see until something in the organization happens and trigger it off. Most of them are quite hidden. So to a large extent, you might not even have an idea that most people are carrying such weight of loneliness for once, such weight of trauma, having such identity crisis. So at the end of the day, they find their way into the system and then climb the ladder of promotion. But over the years, events, engagement, assignment, workload, the entire environment, the challenge of KPIs and the rest of them may easily trigger one of these very, very silent and quiet personality type perspective, and lenses. And then before long, the individual becomes the channel to which the organization becomes weakened. And that is why I'm very, very particular about looking at the organization as a whole, also looking at individuals also personally from their lens of personal development. How do you build yourself such that you don't become the weakest link in an organization? That has been the whole, the vision. And this is why on YouTube I discuss organization and institutions, and while on Facebook I go more personal. Last week or thereabout, we had looked at industrial loneliness, but today we'll be looking at the silent employee. The silent employee. Most organizations are losing ground. They are missing a lot of deliverables. They, they are suffering a lot of churn. A lot is happening in most organizations these days. And one major reason, though there are so many reasons, so many dynamics to look at, different perspective to evaluate, different lenses, to use to look at the entire picture. But today I'll be focusing on one that seems to be very quiet, yet very, very disastrous. And that is what I call the silent employee. You wouldn't know how deep this runs except you walk into a boardroom, for instance, a strategic meeting, for instance, and then you have ideas for a project, for entire, maybe a product you want to launch, or maybe there is a timeline you need to meet, or there's a strategy that needs to be deployed. But at the end of the day, you have everyone seated, especially the team heads, and perhaps the assistants. And sometimes you're dealing with the full room where most of the major players, in the organization are all seated. And then perhaps you deliver your idea, you share your visions, the strategy, every single thing you want to put the tactics, and you look at entirely how you intend to engage the system, engage the market, engage the competitors. But upon you're done, and then you now ask a question. Any question? And then you experience what most people take for granted, what we call the cricket in the boardroom. Everywhere becomes so quiet. So quiet that you will hear the cricket. And then you ask again, any observation? Nothing. Silence. Okay, any input? Maybe one or two, but yet again, silent. And then you keep asking, trying to reframe different perspective, different lenses for which that which have been put, on the table can be reviewed, can be challenged, or should be interrogated. And these are very smart people in the room. But the more you ask, the more everywhere is quiet. And after a while, sometimes most CEOs, most leaders fall into the trap to think that silence actually means agreement. And so for them, it's a wrap. Thank you everyone for coming. We really appreciate. Make sure you plug in and let's make the best of this. Let's deploy on the go. Let's make sure we get the best of results. Everybody, with the banter and chat, and everybody celebrates sometimes, and then everybody leaves. But the fact is that that silence most times does not actually, connote or communicate acceptance or agreement. That silence in the room is as a result of something far, far deeper that most leaders don't pay attention to until it becomes very, very late. I mean, usually you don't understand until the project fails. You will not even understand the consequence. The logic of that silence sometimes usually is not plain until you see a project maybe being sabotaged, or you see when one of your most important team member leaves the tribe when it matters the most, maybe during the launch of a new project, or maybe when the organization is pivoting entirely. At that point, when you think you need everyone to be together, when you need the bond, the understanding, the appreciation, the clarity of the vision, when you just think everybody just have the same clear line of sight, and that is when you see some decisions begin to play out. Why? Because you underestimated that silence in the room. I mean, strategy room, it's supposed to be boisterous. Strategy room is supposed to be very engaging. In fact, strategy room is actually a war center. It's actually warfare, because there you're seeing ideas fly, idea being interrogated, concept being overturned. The whole of this, at the end of the day, is expected to strengthen and show up, you know, that collective brain that makes up the organization. And so, if you miss to reap from that beauty, from that game-changing strength every organization is supposed to, then be rest assured that the consequences will be very there. The silent, employee has so many things that run through their mind most times, and these are some of the few ones. Sometimes when you see an employee get to that point, there are few things that plays, in the head. For many, you understand this basically in general terms as psychological safety. But let's go a little bit down. If you've been following me, you notice that I try to keep this quite simple, easy, and adaptable, something you can easily understand, and then see how best you can scale it up, in practice and deployment. One of the most easiest thing, people think about at that level is that there are smart people, smart, heads in the room who are beginning to feel like, I don't feel safe here anymore. Because the last time I shared my thoughts, the last time I dared to challenge an idea, the last time I was able to actually provide a different lens from what we're seeing, um, it didn't end well with me. Everyone felt I was the difficult one. Most people in the team were looking at me as I was a spoiler, maybe because of the perspective I came with. Eventually, adjusted the timeline, adjusted the entire process flow of what made up maybe a particular strategy or maybe a product, an entire service. And so, for that, if the feedback from that experience didn't end well, then you're going to have um, an employee who is going to go silent, especially when they are needed the most, when their intelligence, their perspective, their exposure, their training, their expertise is actually needed the most. And sometimes you have people who, over the years, consistently have found this to be the challenge of speaking up, of managing um, relationship after standing out in a strategy meeting, in a boardroom meeting. Over the years, just start feeling, look, it really don't make sense for me to put my energy into this, because as it stands, there is no room for anyone to hear any um, conflicting perspective. And so for that, they just give up. While the presentation is going on, they see a perspective. They see a need, perhaps, to review a particular set of information, to reevaluate a particular set of statistics, and perhaps even to investigate the source of that number. They see it clearly, but somewhere along the line, they decide to keep quiet because they feel that it's not worth their energy. And oftentimes, this is where most people feel disconnected. They just feel removed from the room, even though they're in the room, but they just don't feel connected to that same room. And this is where you have people to be present in a board meeting, be present in a strategic session, in a brainstorming uh, engagement. You have them present physically, but cognitively, you don't have them, you know, truly engaging the experience. Why? Because somewhere along the line, they don't feel psychologically safe to be in that environment. Now, for many, well, that's their business. For most leaders, it's not a big deal. If they don't feel safe, that's their business. But for a serious CEO, for a serious team lead, you really want to know why and how this affects you in the long run. Because ultimately, we tend to forget that despite the advent and the growth of AI, technology in general, robotics and the rest of them, whatever you do with a system evidently will always bring efficiency. But the truth is that the growth, sustainability, and the and that uniqueness of an organization still depends on the human mind. That performance you're expecting is dependent on that humans in the process. And so if they don't bring the best of them, if they don't feel optimized, or if they don't optimize their contribution, their offering into the entire system flow, then your performance will go low. And definitely that affects your KPIs. It affects your timeline. It affects your ROI. It affects entirely everything, the vision for which the organization is established. And I want to leave you with some few, you know, items by items for which this behavior, this experience, and how directly it affects you. The first thing you're going to lose when an employee decides to be silent is that you're going to lose information. Every employee is a bundle of information. You know that. You train them to read information. You train them to gather information. You train them to be able to not only collect, but also process information, categorize it, rank it, make information entirely useful. And so they are like a conduit of a data you need to be able to get the kind of results you need. However, when that employee decides to go silent, it means you're losing that entire capacity, that capability that employee has been invested in. You're going to lose it. The second thing you're going to lose is you will lose perspective. You have employee who have the capacity to see things a little bit differently. Recently I just ran into in front. I was NMPC, and we were looking at leadership in a complex world. And one of the core things we discussed and focused on was that most complex problems cannot be solved by an individual. Complex problems can only be solved by a collection of people. Why? Because we have what we call personal intelligence, and then we have collective intelligence. Personal intelligence, however you go about it, gives you a perspective, a narrow view, however broad it is, but a narrow view to a subject matter. because in principle everyone has what they call a blind spot. So there are certain things as a result of culture, upbringing, education, all of that may not allow you, even expertise can trigger some kind of blindness to an individual, especially to a leader. And so it's not everything you have the capacity to see holistically from different perspectives, for different lenses. But when you have a collective, brain in the room, then you have people who can see things from different lenses. Those different lenses, that capacity to have multiple lenses on a subject matter is what gives you strength. It's what gives you that 360 perspective to deal with the entire market, to deal with your customer, to deal with your audience, to deal with the entire flow of every project or product. And so when you have some of your best withdrawing their perspective because they don't feel psychologically safe, then you are losing lenses. And because you're losing lenses, there's a very high possibility that you may take a decision with an incomplete data that, in principle, will influence your outcome, the kind of result you wish to get. It will affect your brand, it will affect your ROI. Then it's going to put you in a difficult situation with your investors. And I don't think it's a good place to be. The next thing you will lose when your employee goes silent is you will lose friction. You will lose conflict. The best products, the best ideas are built from the place of conflict. And then conflict of concept, conflict of creativity, conflict of procedure, um, conflict of form, sometimes even the conflict of essence. All of them put together consistently offers something quite unique because within that conflict, we're able to know what will work and what may not work. And so we heighten your level of risk intelligence. It helps you understand, the place where resistance may even emanate from. And every product or service that have done extremely well are those who can predict where their resistance, either from their customer, from the market, from policies, will emanate from. So they prepare for it. And so when you lose employee who are in the room, but because they don't feel psychological safe, then they withdraw their perspective to challenge an idea, a concept, a procedure, a process, a timeline. Because they withdraw that capacity, they withdraw that positive conflict, you may not be able to see what the market will respond to. And therefore, when you enter into the market, it may just be a disastrous outing. Again, one of the best things that you get from that engagement process is what they call early warning signals. Because of that conflict and that different perspective and that capacity to challenge, process, product, services, and the rest of them. One of the things you get in the process is that early warning signals. It helps you just um, prepare for what will come, from the entire process. But then you need to have people in the room who are, the problem is not bold. Most time we make the mistakes as leaders to think is that they need to be bold. No, it's not needing to be bold. They need to be safe. Two different things. Bold is you just have to go ahead and make an issue out of it. Safe is I know it might not be palatable. I know it's going to be um, might look disturbing, but the fact is that that contribution is opening up our, line of sight to be able to have to what I may call embrace eventualities. So more or less, it gives you that capacity to see challenge ahead of time. But if you don't, and you have an employee that goes silent, then you will lose it. Again, the market will tell you what you refuse or you were not able to hear early enough in the strategy room. The market will respond to that. And lastly, is learning. Engagement gives birth to learning. There is this particular framework that I use a lot when I'm leading or facilitating a training on complex leadership, complexity, ambiguity, and the rest of them. One of them is adaptive color ribbon. Now, ACT ribbon is adaptive color thinking ribbon, actually. Now, what it does is that you give rules. It's a role playing process. Using the color of the ribbon, you give rules to everyone on the table and allow them to argue a particular project from a perspective and interpretation of the ribbon that they have on their wrist. And then after a while, you switch the role and, if possible, make them bear the role of those they oppose the most, just so that they can experience a different lens and perspective, to the entire discussion. And every time the response, the experience has been phenomenal. Because the reason is that for once, you see people who experience what others experience, the shoes, the interest other people had at the point they were arguing for a particular, project, product, or service. And so they wear the shoes of the people they felt were um, the worst set of persons in the room. And so after a while, they get to understand that it's not a personality thing. It's actually an interest-driven discussion. And therefore, interest also changes, just as market and policies will change. And so you don't get angry with a person. You don't angry with your competition. You don't get angry with a team member. You don't get angry with your leader, thinking that it's all about what they want. No, it's about the interest on the table in a particular project, product, or service. And that helps you experience things you never thought, was understandable. Because for you, it's about the other person, not about you. And so when you lose employees who are not willing to engage that back and forth, it means you lose learning moments because they're not able to tackle their thoughts, their concepts, their ideas, exposure, education, and expertise. Because you can't, the Bible will say, iron sharpened iron. That's what the scripture says. So they're not able to have that iron, hitting it with each other to be able to throw that sparks. Most of them, the room may not be able to learn something new, learn a perspective, learn a defense, learn an attack, learn everything that comes with that kind of environment. And at the end of the day, the failure to learn that at a collective level is what oftentimes will lead to the organization or brand making mistakes they are not supposed to make. And who loses again? The organization. So that tells you that the silent employee, if not well managed, is a very huge disaster. Okay, Maxwell said, seeing a comment here, said it is very interesting that conflict can be useful and positive in the sense that conflict is usually perceived to be negative in the true sense of the word. This is a massive insight for me. Yes, Maxwell, indeed. It's most people mistake what conflict is. At the very simple explanation, conflict simply means the beginning of the end of yesterday and the beginning of tomorrow, the end of what existed and the beginning of what is said to be exist that will or that seeks to exist. So at the end of the day, it's just a brush off of is a warfare between what is and what can and what should, what may even be. So at the end of the day, if it is properly curated, every form of conflict, especially if it is managed by those who are emotionally matured, who have emotional intelligence, who understand that conflict is an avenue for learning, at the end of the day, they will stop it from entering crisis. What most people think um, is the issue with conflict is that they mistake crisis for conflict. Crisis is when conflict becomes complicated, when more things are thrown into the jar and it becomes messy. But conflict simply means it's a push, it's like a tug of war, it's a game of direction, it's a game of emergence, it's actually the place of creativity and innovation. So conflict is positive. However, it needs to be midwife properly. I've come to the end of today. And like I said, the key focus is to watch out for the silent employee. How do you know this is happening? It's when you have a room full of very smart and very intelligent people. But then, after a robust discussion or a presentation of a new idea or maybe a new formula, a new product, or maybe an emerging um, protocol, and then you now throw this question open to the room, and then the room goes quiet, so quiet that you can hear the cricket. And then you keep reframing. Do you have questions? Do you have contributions? Do you have anything, any reason you feel this will not work? And then the more as a leader you keep reframing, the more everywhere keeps going quiet. In that kind of scenario, you are having silent employees. And like I said, while this may not be the law, but generally speaking, most experiences in a boardroom of that nature actually is saying silence does not necessarily mean um, agreement with the process, with the rules, with the model, with the product service protocol. Does not necessarily mean agreement. It simply speaks to something deeper and more dangerous, that here is not a safe place to share my thoughts concerning what is being discussed. And that is a very big gap for every organization, for any leader who finds himself in that situation. That is a very, very big gap. It is something you have to watch out for, and then it's something you have to make sure that it does not occur. And even if it does, take it as a feedback and do some homework, background check to find out what is making my team go quiet when I need them to speak the most. This is one very important area that as a team lead, as a CEO, you'll be able to drive performance in your organization. So I will stop here and I hope we meet again next week, Monday. And like I said, if you want to follow up and catch up for the personal development, personal transformation, hit me up on Facebook. Let's continue the discussions there. You can watch most of the repair or replay, or even watch some of the short videos that explain most of the concepts for which I use in most of my explanation. But the key word is that we're looking at performance, where we look at efficiency with AI support, the project flow, the SOPs, and all the structures you need to put in place. While that is very important, you need to understand that except the human, those who make up your team are optimized. They will not bring their best into the system. And if they don't bring their best into the system, you may not necessarily get the best of the entire resources that you're leading. And as a leader, it is your duty to be able to optimize every single item and resource in your care, just so that you can get the kind of result you want. Whether you want it an accelerated result, whether you want a very highly optimized result, whether you want a very unique and standout result. But anyhow you want to go about it, but you want to increase your revenue exponentially, the fact remains that in and from your team, you must get their 100% buy-in just so that you can get 100% kind of performance and results. And if you're not getting that, you get anything below 75, then there is a challenge. In fact, anything below 80 is even a challenge, because the question is, why will they be withholding that 20%? That 20% might just be the difference between you and your competitor, the difference between your brand and the next brand, the difference between an existing brand and emerging brand. That might just be the difference. So that need to make sure that your team come to the table with all they have, just so that you get the kind of result you need, is very essential. And that is why we discuss this. So I look forward to connecting. If you have questions, please, you can drop through my email. And if you have to even drop it during replay where you're watching and you want to comment, please do. I will try to see as best as possible to respond to them. And if you need something outside what we're discussing now, more insight and more technical details to leadership, emotional intelligence, transformation, whether it is on a personal level, whether it is collective and organizational level, be rest assured, if you reach out to me, I'll make sure I respond also in kind, and then we can pick it up from there. Thank you, and do have a very beautiful